On May 7, 2017, an emergency call came into police in Bel Air, Ohio. A woman had just entered a house and found something deeply disturbing: a man lying motionless in the basement. Officers rushed to the home, expecting a medical emergency. But the moment they stepped inside, the scene told a very different story. Down in the basement, they found Brad McGarry, a 43-year-old coal miner, lying in a pool of blood. He had been shot. Twice. Both bullets fired into the back of his head. And the house itself looked strange. Drawers open, belongings scattered, as if someone had forced their way in and ransacked the place. At first glance, it looked like a robbery, but detectives quickly noticed something that didn't make sense. Nothing valuable was missing. So ask yourself this for a second. If this was really a robbery, why leave everything behind? That's when investigators began to suspect something much darker. Someone had entered this home, someone Brad trusted enough to let inside, and then that person executed him in his own basement. Standing there at the crime scene, detectives started asking a question that would shape the entire investigation. Was this a failed robbery, or was this murder deeply personal? Because the truth behind Brad McGarry's death would soon reveal a secret relationship, a hidden double life, and a betrayal that no one in this quiet town saw coming. At first, the scene in Bel Air, Ohio, looked like a robbery. But the deeper investigators looked into the murder of Brad McGarry, the more it started to feel personal. And to understand why, we first need to look at who Brad McGarry really was. To understand why the death of Brad McGarry shook so many people, you have to understand the kind of man he was long before that basement crime scene ever existed. Brad wasn't someone who lived a flashy life. He grew up in the quiet communities along the Ohio River, eventually settling in Bel Air, Ohio, a place where life tends to move slowly and where reputations often follow you for decades. People there remember things: who you are, how you treat people, what kind of man you become. And by most accounts, Brad McGarry was the kind of person people liked having around. He had a big personality, the type that could fill a room with jokes and laughter. Friends described him as someone who loved being around people, the kind of guy who would host gatherings, collect antiques for his home, and make everyone feel welcome when they walked through his door. But Brad's life also had another layer that many people in small towns understand all too well. He was openly gay. Now, today, that might not sound unusual, but growing up and living as a gay man in a tight-knit rural community can sometimes mean living under a constant microscope. And Brad experienced that early in life. Friends later said he dealt with insults and cruel labels when he was younger, the kind of things people sometimes say when they don't understand someone who's different. But Brad didn't hide. He didn't pretend to be someone else just to make people comfortable. Instead, he did something that takes a lot more courage than people realize. He simply lived his life as himself. And in a place where coal mining is one of the toughest jobs around, Brad chose to work in that exact environment. Think about that for a moment. A man openly living as gay, working one of the roughest, most physically demanding jobs in a culture often dominated by traditional masculinity. For Brad, it was almost a quiet statement. You could be yourself and still stand shoulder to shoulder with anyone else. He worked hard, he earned respect, and over the years he built a circle of friends who saw him for who he really was, someone loyal, funny, and deeply social. But if you look closely at Brad's life, you start to notice something interesting. Despite having many friends, despite being well known around Bel Air, Brad's personal relationships were often complicated. He loved deeply, sometimes maybe too deeply. And that tendency, that desire to form strong emotional bonds with the people closest to him, would eventually connect his life to someone who would change everything. At this point in the story, Brad McGarry was simply living his life, working long hours, spending time with friends and family, hosting people in the same home where investigators would later stand over his body. Nothing about his routine suggested that something terrible was coming. But behind the normal rhythm of everyday life, a relationship had quietly been growing, a relationship that most people around Brad never fully understood. And that relationship would eventually lead detectives directly to the person responsible for his death.
At some point during those years in Bel Air, another person quietly entered Brad McGarry's life in a way that would eventually change everything. His name was David Carl Kinney. Now, if you had looked at David Kinney from the outside, you probably would have seen someone living a completely ordinary life. He lived in the same small-town environment as Brad, worked regular jobs, and like many people in Bel Air, his life followed the same routine most residents were familiar with. Work during the day, home at night, conversations with neighbors, and the quiet rhythm that defines a place where people often live their entire lives in the same few square miles. But there was another important detail about Kinney that made his life very different from Brad's. David Kinney was married. To the outside world, he appeared to be living a traditional family life, a husband, a man with responsibilities, a person whose identity fit neatly into the expectations of the small community around him. And this is where the story starts to take on a very complicated emotional layer. Because despite the public life Kinney was living, somewhere along the way he and Brad McGarry became close. At first, it looked like nothing more than friendship. In towns like Bel Air, friendships form easily. People meet through work, mutual acquaintances, or just through the natural social circles that form in smaller communities. Brad was the kind of person who enjoyed having people around him. His house often became a place where conversations happened, where friends stopped by to relax or talk. It wasn't unusual for people to spend time there. Kinney eventually became one of those people. At first, nothing about it seemed unusual. Two men spending time together, talking, visiting each other's homes. That kind of friendship isn't uncommon, especially in communities where social circles are smaller and people rely heavily on friendships for connection. But friendships sometimes grow into something more complicated, and in this case, that's exactly what happened. Over time, the relationship between Brad McGarry and David Kinney moved beyond friendship and into something much more personal, a secret romantic relationship. Now pause for a moment and really think about what that situation must have looked like from both sides. Brad was openly gay. He had already accepted that part of his identity and lived his life with a level of honesty about who he was, even in a community where that sometimes brought criticism. Kinney, on the other hand, was living a very different reality. He was married to a woman and publicly known as a straight man. Those two worlds do not easily overlap. So if their relationship was going to exist at all, it had to exist quietly. Very quietly. Hidden from most of the people around them. And that kind of secrecy can create an emotional pressure that slowly builds over time. Imagine living two completely different lives at once. One life that your family, friends, and neighbors see every day. And another life that only one other person knows about. The stress of keeping those worlds separate can become overwhelming, especially in a town where rumors travel faster than facts. For Brad, the relationship may have felt meaningful. He was someone who formed strong emotional connections with people, and when he trusted someone, he tended to let them into his life fully. He opened his home to Kinney. They spent time together. Conversations that probably began as simple friendship slowly became something deeper, something more personal. But relationships built on secrecy rarely stay simple. Over time, a small number of people in the community began to notice the closeness between the two men. Not everyone understood the full nature of their relationship, but whispers have a way of forming in places where everyone pays attention to everyone else. and whispers in small towns can be powerful. Sometimes they're harmless, sometimes they're dangerous, because if even a small portion of those rumors reached the wrong ears, it could threaten everything Kinney had built in his public life: his marriage, his reputation, his place in the community. That possibility created a tension that likely existed beneath the surface of their relationship. On one side, you had Brad McGarry, someone who had already embraced his identity and lived openly with it. On the other side, you had David Kinney, a man who may have been struggling to keep two versions of himself from colliding. And when people live in that kind of emotional conflict, fear can begin to creep in. Fear of being exposed, fear of losing the life you've built, fear of what others will say when the truth comes out. Those fears don't always appear suddenly. Sometimes they grow slowly, quietly, over months or even years. At this stage in the story, though, none of that tension had fully surfaced yet. To Brad, Kinney was someone he trusted, someone he allowed into the private spaces of his life, someone who could walk through the door of his house without raising suspicion. That level of trust is important to remember, because when investigators later examined the events surrounding Brad's death, one fact would stand out above almost everything else. The killer didn't break into the house. There were no signs of forced entry, which means the person responsible for what happened in that basement was almost certainly someone Brad allowed inside willingly, someone he knew, someone he trusted. And when detectives eventually started looking at the people who had the closest relationship with Brad McGarry, one name kept appearing again and again: David Kinney. At that moment in the timeline, no one in Bel Air could have predicted how that relationship would eventually end. Two men connected by a secret relationship. Two lives quietly overlapping in ways most of the town didn't see. And somewhere within that connection, the tension that would eventually lead to violence was already beginning to form. The problem was, no one realized it yet.
The day before everything changed in Bel Air, Ohio, seemed completely ordinary for Brad McGarry. It was the kind of quiet day that blends into the routine of small-town life: familiar streets, familiar faces, and the same daily rhythm Brad had been living for years. He spent time around his home, the same place where friends often stopped by to talk or relax. Nothing about the atmosphere suggested anything unusual. Just another normal day in a town where people rarely expect something dramatic to happen. But sometimes the most ordinary days quietly hold moments that later become important. Brad was still in contact with people within his circle, having the kind of conversations and interactions that happen naturally between friends. At the time, none of it stood out. But when investigators would later look back at those final hours, they began asking simple questions. Who had spoken with Brad that day? Who had planned to see him next? Because sometimes the answers to a mystery begin in the quiet moments no one thought to pay attention to. The morning that would later shake the quiet town of Bel Air, Ohio, began like any other ordinary day. Nothing about the streets or the neighborhood suggested that something terrible had already happened inside the home of Brad McGarry. The town was moving through its usual rhythm, people going to work, traffic passing through familiar roads, and neighbors starting their day the same way they always had. From the outside, Brad's house looked completely normal. No broken windows, no police tape, nothing that would make anyone stop and look twice. But that calm image would soon be shattered. Later that day, Brad's friend David Carl Kinney arrived at the house, along with Kinney's wife, Rebecca Kinney. According to what was later described during the investigation, the two had come to the house together. When they went inside, they eventually made their way toward the basement area of the home. What they saw there instantly turned an ordinary morning into the beginning of a homicide investigation. Brad McGarry was lying motionless on the basement floor. The moment must have felt unreal. For a few seconds, the mind tries to process what the eyes are seeing, hoping there is some other explanation. but the condition of the scene made it clear that something violent had taken place. The discovery immediately triggered a call to authorities, and within a short time the quiet street began filling with police vehicles as officers arrived to secure the scene. Once investigators entered the house, they began carefully documenting everything around them. Experienced detectives know that the first look at a crime scene can sometimes reveal details that later become crucial. Inside Brad's home, officers began noticing things that raised immediate questions. Parts of the house looked disturbed, drawers had been opened, and items appeared to be moved around as if someone had been searching through them. At first glance, the scene looked like it could have been a robbery, but detectives are trained to question what they see, because sometimes a scene that appears obvious on the surface can be misleading. As investigators examined the house more closely, something didn't add up. Many valuable items were still inside the home. Electronics, personal belongings, and other objects that someone committing a burglary would normally take were still there, untouched. If someone had really broken into the house to steal, why leave those things behind? That detail alone caused detectives to start considering another possibility. Sometimes a crime scene is deliberately staged to look like something else. If the house had been made to look like it was ransacked, maybe the person responsible wanted investigators to believe a robbery had taken place, even if that wasn't the real reason for what happened. With that thought in mind, investigators moved to the next critical step in the process, building a timeline. They needed to understand Brad's final hours. When had he last been seen alive? Who had spoken with him recently? Who might have visited the house before his body was discovered? In a town like Bel Air, those answers sometimes begin to appear quickly because people know each other well. Detectives began interviewing people who were part of Brad's life, friends, acquaintances, and neighbors who might have seen him or spoken with him recently. Each conversation added another small piece to the growing timeline. What investigators learned was that Brad had been living his life normally in the days leading up to the discovery. There were no clear reports that he was afraid of anyone or expecting trouble, nothing that suggested he believed someone might harm him. But one detail from the scene continued to stand out. There were no clear signs of forced entry. No broken doors, no smashed windows, no evidence that someone had forced their way inside. And that detail matters a lot in cases like this, because when someone enters a home without forcing their way in, it usually means the victim knew them or trusted them enough to let them inside. So detectives began focusing on a new question. Who had access to Brad McGarry's home? Who had visited before? Who might have been welcomed inside without raising suspicion? As investigators looked deeper into Brad's personal life and relationships, they began mapping out the people who were closest to him, friends who had spent time at the house, people who knew his routines, people who could move through the home without appearing out of place. And in the case of Brad McGarry, investigators were beginning to believe that the truth about what happened in that basement wasn't going to come from a stranger passing through town. It was going to come from someone who already knew the house. During interviews, investigators carefully compared timelines. Who had spoken with Brad recently? Who had been seen near the house? Who had reason to be there at all? One by one, small pieces of information began to line up, and slowly the investigation started forming a clearer direction. One name kept returning to the center of those conversations: David Carl Kinney. At first, Kinney's presence in the case didn't appear suspicious. After all, he had been one of the people who reported finding Brad in the basement. He had walked into the house with his wife, Rebecca Kinney, and from the outside, it looked like he had simply discovered something terrible and alerted authorities. But experienced investigators are trained to pay attention to inconsistencies. As detectives continued examining the scene and comparing it with the statements they were receiving, certain details didn't fully match the picture that had initially been presented. Small things, the kind that may seem insignificant individually, started standing out when placed side by side. Then another important layer of the story began emerging. During interviews, investigators learned more about the personal connection between Brad McGarry and David Kinney. What had appeared to many people as a simple friendship was actually far more complicated. The two men had been involved in a secret romantic relationship, something that had been kept hidden from much of the community. And that revelation suddenly added a new dimension to the investigation. Because now detectives weren't just looking at a random act of violence, they were looking at a relationship that existed behind closed doors. A relationship that, if exposed publicly, could have dramatically affected Kinney's life. He was married, living in a small town where reputation and public image often carried enormous weight. If the truth about that relationship had become widely known, it could have threatened everything about the life he had built. As detectives quietly explored that angle, they also continued analyzing the physical evidence from the crime scene. And the more they compared the evidence with the timeline, the more the pieces began pointing in the same direction. The staged appearance of the house, the lack of forced entry, the personal relationship between the victim and someone already connected to the scene. When those elements are combined, investigators often begin seeing a pattern. Eventually, the investigation reached a point where detectives believed they understood what had happened inside that house. According to what authorities would later present in court, David Carl Kinney had gone to Brad McGarry's home during a private meeting between the two. At some point inside the house, the situation turned violent. What began as a personal encounter ended with Brad being fatally attacked in the basement of his own home. But the story didn't end there. After the killing, investigators believed Kinney attempted to create the appearance of a burglary inside the house. Drawers were opened, items were disturbed, and parts of the home were left looking as if someone had searched through them. The goal, according to investigators, appeared to be simple: make the crime look like it wasn't a random robbery. But the details of the scene told another story. And once detectives connected the evidence with the timeline and the hidden relationship between the two men, the picture became impossible to ignore. The person who had first appeared as a witness in the case had slowly become the center of the investigation.
As the investigation in Bel Air, Ohio continued to unfold, the evidence that detectives had been quietly gathering finally reached a point where authorities believed they had enough to take action. The timeline, the physical evidence inside the home, and the hidden relationship between Brad McGarry and David Carl Kinney had slowly built a case that investigators believed explained what had really happened inside that house. For the small town of Bel Air, the arrest was shocking. What had once looked like a tragic and mysterious crime had now turned into something far more personal. A case involving secrecy, relationships hidden from the public, and a man accused of killing someone he personally knew. When the case moved into the courtroom, prosecutors began laying out the story they believed the evidence supported. They argued that Kinney had gone to Brad's house for a private meeting, and that at some point inside the home, the situation escalated into violence. After the killing, prosecutors said he attempted to stage the scene to make it appear like a burglary, hoping investigators would believe the crime had been committed by an unknown intruder. The trial forced many details of Brad McGarry's private life into public view, including the secret relationship that had existed between the two men. Witnesses were called, evidence from the house was presented, and the timeline that investigators had carefully built during the investigation was explained to the court. For the jury, the case ultimately came down to whether the evidence proved that David Kinney had intentionally taken Brad's life. After hearing the testimony and reviewing the evidence presented during the trial, the jury reached its decision. David Carl Kinney was found guilty of murder. The court later sentenced him to life in prison, meaning he would spend the rest of his life behind bars for the killing of Brad McGarry. And with that verdict, the legal chapter of the case finally came to an end. closing one of the most disturbing and personal murder cases the town of Bel Air had ever seen. When you look at the case of Brad McGarry in Bel Air, Ohio, the most disturbing part isn't just the crime, it's how ordinary everything looked before it happened. Brad wasn't living a dangerous life. He was simply surrounded by people he knew and trusted. But in many cases like this, the threat doesn't come from strangers. It comes from someone already inside your circle. And that leaves one uncomfortable question. How well do we really know the people around us? If you want to watch more true crime stories like this, subscribe to my channel UnionX Crime for more documentaries.